Welcome, guys, to our monthly meeting of the New York City Neighborhood Naturalists Group, which is part of the New York City EcoFlora project. My name is Lydia Paradiso, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and a graduate fellow working with the New York City EcoFlora project. NYBG first created this project back in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The EcoFlora is a community science project that has three main goals: to investigate urban ecosystems and urbanization, to support open source biodiversity data, and to increase understanding and appreciation of plant life. To date, our current numbers, we have over 30,000 observers, which have made over 875,000 observations of plants and their biotic partners in New York City. You can explore the observations on our iNaturalist page, which I'll link in the chat in a second. As part of our activities, each month we sponsor an EcoQuest challenge, which encourages New Yorkers to observe a particular species or a group of species and post them onto iNaturalist. The EcoQuest for November is entitled Hidden Harvest. Familiar plants such as Chenopodium, amaranth, purslane, sunflower, and cattail and pawpaws are some of the remnant species that have been managed and cultivated by indigenous societies for thousands of years before the arrival of colonists to the Americas and continue to this day. Many of these species persist in New York City, but their uses, histories, and cultural relevance are often overlooked, and they're often treated as weeds. So for this EcoQuest, we have more than 50 different species with histories like this that are found in New York City, and we challenge you to try to find them all. So here is a link to some more information about the EcoFlora project in general. And here is a link to the Hidden Harvest project on iNat, where you can see that list of species and see some of the observations that we've got for this month so far. Also, one other announcement that I have before we go into our talk for tonight. Next week, we're going to have our first hybrid talk on Tuesday at 2 p.m. So the talk, which will be given by Sophie Breitbart from the University of Toronto, will focus on the effects of urbanization on plant-pollinator interactions and evolution in milkweeds. The talk will be given at the Ross Hall at NYBG, but we'll also have a Zoom component as well. So if you're interested to sign up for either one of those, here's the link. Okay, so just in order how the talks, if you're familiar with this or not, how our talks usually work, please feel free to enter any questions or comments in the chat as we go. And at the conclusion of the talk, we'll go through them. If you have a question or comment that you want to ask verbally at the end, we also encourage that. So at that point, you can just do the hand raise or note in the chat, and we'll make sure that you have the opportunity to ask. And if you're unable to stay for the whole talk or you want to share the talk with others, we will have a recording available on our YouTube page, where we also have recordings of the past talks that we've given. All right, now I'll turn it over to Tony for our land acknowledgement and speaker introduction.
I'd like to begin this seminar with a land acknowledgement by recognizing the original people of the land, the Lenape, as well as their deep connection to the Lenape-Hoking homeland, which is the Northeast, including New York State. As an organization dedicated to advocating for the more than human world, we must acknowledge those who are original stewards of the land and believe in the importance of acknowledging the settler colonial genocide perpetrated against the indigenous communities, as well as the resilience of the Lenape, who still today continue to resist erasure. So without further ado, today we are hosting Jason Aloisio, who has more than 10 years of experience designing, conducting, supervising, and evaluating urban ecology research and education programs. His published research focuses on socio-ecological dynamics of urban ecosystems, urban plant ecology, urban environmental education, and broadening participation in STEM fields. Tonight, we will hear from him about socio-ecological dynamics of green roof ecosystems. Go ahead and take it away, Jason.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here. Let me see if I can share my slides here. And does that look right to everybody? Okay, fantastic. Great. Great. So as Tony mentioned, I will be talking about socio-ecological dynamics of green roof ecosystems. And there we go. A little roadmap, treasure map for this evening, talk outline. I'm going to start with the thesis of my talk this evening and try to make my key points in the next slide and have some evidence to support that. I'll talk a little bit about me, my background. I'm going to introduce green roof ecosystems and give a little bit of history of green roofs, how they've been used throughout time. And then I'm going to talk about ecological dynamics of those green roofs, shifting over to sociological dynamics of green roofs, and then some concluding thoughts. And I'm going to try to use a lot of examples of green roof research right here in New York City, a bunch of my own research and others that have conducted research in New York City. So to wrap up my argument here, or my talk topic, is that green roofs are socio-ecological systems. And so I sort of have three components of that. Sort of the first one is that green roofs are constructed ecosystems, and they are influenced by the preferences of stakeholders and designers. Okay. The second component of that is that they are dynamic systems. They're non-static, and they're going to change through time in various different ways. And green roofs are also can potentially have positive impacts on people that interact with those green roofs. So I'm going to try to hit on all those points this evening. Okay, so a little bit about my background. Here's me growing up out east on Long Island in Suffolk County. As I mentioned, my roots are from New York City. There's me kind of being a rambunctious little guy, playing in the pool, loving my bicycle, jumping my skis all over the place. I loved being outside growing up. I was a Boy Scout. I'm an Eagle Scout. Spent a lot of time camping and adventuring around with my brothers and my father. I was kind of a punk with a little bit of Mohawk action there in high school, played music, was a drummer, continued to play semi-professionally in New York City for many years. After graduating undergraduate, I'd be really passionate and interested in nature, sort of continued that throughout my life and worked as a naturalist for a number of years before I ultimately started my PhD at Fordham University in the Bronx, right across the street from the Botanical Garden in 2008. And when I was there, I founded a student community garden and CSA called St. Rose's Garden. It's still there to this day. It's 10 years old at this point. And it's a CSA, community support agriculture. We have a farm partner that brings food into Fordham University. People buy shares. Probably most of you are familiar with CSAs. And the garden is still thriving. I haven't been involved with it for many years, but it's still there, and it was a major passion of mine while I was there. And I also, while at Fordham, started working for the Wildlife Conservation Society over at the Bronx Zoo next door, and co-founded and ran a National Science Foundation funded program called Project True, Teens Researching Urban Ecology, which was a research mentoring summer camp program, basically, for high school, undergraduate, and graduate students. And we ran this program for, like 7 years. It still, again, runs to this day with me not being there anymore. And I'll be coming back to this during some of my discussion. And that now, more recently, since sort of I've left the Wildlife Conservation Society, most recently, a couple of years ago, I jumped on my bicycle and rode from the Bronx Zoo all the way down to Belize, and then flew to Bogota, Colombia, and then rode my bike all the way down to Santiago, Chile, as the pandemic was exploding from October 2019 to March 2020, and with the hope of eventually making it all the way down to the southern tip of South America, but was needed to evacuate because of the pandemic, of course. And I sort of embarked on this journey from my interest and passion and love for exploring the urban environment, exploring the natural environment. I was sort of doing a transcontinental transect of the human footprint, trying to smell, breathe, taste, touch, and feel what the human footprint was like and how humanity interacted with the natural environment at a global scale. So I've been always very interested in the interactions between nature and humanity, both from an academic standpoint and from a personal standpoint. Today, I live in Dutchess County. Oh, did I freeze? I appear to be frozen. Nope. Okay, I'm good. Today, I now live in the Hudson Valley, north of New York City, about an hour and a half, near Millbrook. And I use iNaturalist still as well. I'm currently documenting the species that live on our property. We have about 2 acres here and a creek. We live at Sprout Creek, which is an important cold water habitat that feeds into the Fishkill and the Hudson River. And so it's been wonderful exploring a new ecosystem up here. And yes, I'm riding my bike a ton up here as well. And the roads are fantastic. So that's just a little bit about me and sort of where I'm at. And I want to start now to dig into green roofs a little bit. So what is a green roof? I'm not sure what anybody, I appear to be frozen again. Nope, okay, good. What is a green roof? So let's dive into it here. I was always interested in this interaction. And so green roofs were very, very appealing to me because they were sort of the epitome of this interaction between nature and humanity, because humans created these ecosystems. And so when I started my work at Fordham, I began studying these green roofs. And green roofs here are vegetated rooftops, right? And they are formed through a series of layers, okay? A green roof, sort of on top of a roof, we have a wet waterproofing layer that goes on top of the roof to sort of protect it and seal it. Then we have sort of a protection layer to prevent roots from going down into that rooftop. Then we have sort of a drainage layer that allows water to move laterally along that rooftop, so we don't have pooling or anything like that. And then we have sort of this filter sheet that again just sort of reduces the amount of sedimentation that kind of comes out into that hydrological layer. And then we have growing media and the plant material that we actually grow on that green roof. And this one right here, this roof is actually on Five Borough, which is on what is it, Randall's Island. And this is kind of like a almost sort of typical green roof that you might see. And if we were to kind of look at green roofs and typify them, there's kind of like 3 main groups of green roofs. There are the extensive green roofs, which are green roofs that are planted with very shallow growing media, just usually a couple centimeters to maybe 10 centimeters. And then we have sort of these semi-intensive green roofs that are classified by generally deeper growing media, maybe 10 centimeters to 20 centimeters or so. And then we have intensive green roofs, which could have, upwards of feet of growing media on it. And on those kinds of green roofs, we can have trees planted and really big plant material that has deep-rooted deep roots. Whereas on the extensive and semi-intensive green roofs, we have relatively shallow growing media. So we're restricted by the plants that we can grow on there. We're typically not growing large woody shrubs or trees. All right, so those are the 3 main kinds. We're just going to take a little tour of the various green roofs that we might see. This is down in New York City, in Chelsea, PS 41. This is another green roof. We can see that there's a variety of different species on here, but one of the most common species that we see here are sedum or succulent plants. Here we see another green roof. This is a house now. Again, we're seeing a lot of flat roofs with green roofs on them, of course, because it's quite a bit easier to plant, get growing media up there. Speaking of the growing media, the media that are generally used for this are an engineered growing media. It's kind of like a sand substrate. Doesn't have a lot of organic material in it because you don't want really heavy weights on those roofs, but it varies quite a bit among the different kinds of roofs. And of course, this here is a sloped roof with a beautiful grassland growing, a beautiful meadow growing on top of it. Here's another sloped roof with more of a sort of a sedum planting palette on top of it. Another little hobbit hole. I'd love to live in that house. It looks just wonderfully cozy. And here's kind of an example of more of some of the UK style green roof where we're using brown. It might be classified as a brown roof with kind of aggregate construction materials used for recycled construction materials used for those green roof growing media. And a little bit more of a wild looking landscape, perhaps a little bit unmanaged. Here, this is a sort of a classic example of something we might see in Germany, and they even have these beekeeping homes on top of them. So that's pretty wonderful. And then even here, this is down in the South Bronx area, and we can see on this green roof we have different kinds of substrate, or large stones and finer material, logs, different kinds of habitat features for various kinds of organisms to increase biodiversity on this roof. So this is another example. This is a classic example of the green roof in Chicago. Chicago is one of the cities with the most number of green roofs of all cities in the United States. Here's another beautiful example of a recreational green roof where we can see it's a park and people are up on this roof enjoying the beauty of this oasis in the midst of the busy urban jungle. This is down at the Brooklyn Grange. Probably some of us may be familiar with that, the biggest rooftop agricultural green roof in North America. And here's another picture of it. It's in Long Island City. This is Eagle Street rooftop farm, which is down in Brooklyn. Another example of an agricultural rooftop. And we even have some bigger ones down in Manhattan. This is the Jacob Javits Center there. This is one of the largest green roofs. This is again characterized by sedum and an intensive growing media, so shallow growing media spread really wide. And then the Barclay Center in Brooklyn for my BK folks, we got a green roof on there. It's a little bit of a sloped green roof, and that's again extensive green roof, very thin growing media. That's actually, it was in mats, so they actually like rolled out just as if you would like sod, or if you rolled out a carpet, it just kind of like grew these mats of sedum in the horticultural facilities, bring them up there and just roll these mats out of sedum and growing media on top of these roofs, like the Barclay Center. You can also integrate photovoltaics with green roofs, and this is again on Fiborough in Randall's Island. So that's just kind of a little bit of a suite of sort of introduction to the variety of green roofs. And I want to just take a step back in time a little bit and talk about, these green roofs are all from modern day, but of course, plants and structures have been, people and plants and structures have gone together forever, right? We of course use wood to build our buildings from plants, from trees, but in fact, we used plant material as roofing material for thousands of years. So scholars argue a little bit on the specifics, but it is generally agreed upon that sort of the earliest sort of known green roofs or rooftop gardens date back to Mesopotamia. So 2200 BC to 500 BC. Okay, and I'm not sure if my pronunciation is right, but the ziggurat of I apologize, I'm not a historian, right, of course, but this was a temple-like structure that was on the left. This is an actual structure that's still there today. It's obviously eroding substantially, and on the right is artists' rendering of what it might have looked like, 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, just beautifully painted with plant material all over it. All right. And the next well-known example are the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, dating back to about 600 years ago BC. Okay. And again, some artist representations of what we think it might have looked like. And these were clearly or thought of as gardens, right? They're not this extensive green roof ecosystem with a thin layer of substrate and sedum planted all over them. They were ornate gardens with presumably plant material from all over the known world at that time, and were very, very beautiful. Were very, very beautiful. I would have loved to have seen what these might have looked like if I could have a time machine and go back there. And then, of course, plant material has also been used to this day. For example, in the turf houses of Iceland, it's known that that plant material was grown on rooftops to hold in warmth or to help cool, depending on the climate that you're in. And these turf rooftop environments date back to 800 AD and are still used to this day. And these are some actual live examples. And then in sort of the coming to modern history, the sort of most modern the earliest recorded modern example of a green roof is thought to be from the International Exposition in Paris, the World's Fair in Paris in 1867. There was a model of a green roof with sort of the same layers that I described on top of a concrete material with some drainage layers and growing media and some planted material. And so that was about 150 years ago at that point. And then sort of coming a little more into the future, right here in New York City, Rockefeller Center, of course, installed a green roof in the 1930s, mid-1930s. They installed these beautiful green roofs that they tried to have people come to. And this is, as far as we really know, this is kind of one of the earliest examples of green roofs coming to North America. So still about, only, what is that, 90 years ago, about 90 years ago at this point. And then sort of in Germany in the 1960s, modern green roofs really started to expand and become popular, okay? There were, and actually in 1982, in Germany, this yellow booklet was the green roofing guideline. It was the very first guideline that was created to help engineers, architects, designers, and construction folks build green roofs with a standardized format. So this is a long, almost 200-page document that describes all the specifics about how to design, how to install a green roof, the kinds of properties that the various layered materials should have, properties that the growing media should have, some suggestions on plant palettes, etc. And a number of policy instruments have been passed in Germany, even back in those days, dating back to the 90s, to encourage green roofs to be installed. And in fact, in 1997, Munich required that all buildings that had a flat roof that were more than 100 square meters were required to install a green roof. So as a result of that, there were a large increase in the number of green roofs in Germany and some of the other Scandinavian countries. So they were really the early adopters in the modern era and the leaders in green roof technology. And then research on green roofs, peer-reviewed research, didn't even start to come out until the late 1990s, 96, 97, 98, and the early 2000s. So this is a very nascent field in terms of research that's going on. And in those early years of the 1990s to the early 2000s, the main research focused on plant selection, growing media selection, stormwater management potential of those green roofs, and the cooling potential of those green roofs, of course. So we can show a little bit of a I'm having trouble with that word. There's more a cartoon. I'm going to call it a cartoon on the right-hand side here, showing a green roof and some of the ecosystem services or benefits to humans that are provided. So green roofs absorb water where it lands, right? And decrease the amount of water that goes into our combined sewer right here in New York City, and more than 700 other cities in New York City across the United States. And of course, when we urbanize, we decrease the amount of water capture potential by paving over surfaces. And as it rains, all this water goes into our combined sewer, mixing with our wastewater and potentially leading to outflows into our surrounding waterways. So it's really important to utilize strategies like green infrastructure and green roofs to capture water where it lands. So that was like a big focus for early green roof research, was really showing how much water can we absorb? Do we improve the quality of that stormwater effluent? And then the other big part of early green roof research was this urban heat island mitigation effect. Of course, when you installed a green roof on top of a building, it potentially reduced the amount of energy you needed to both cool and heat that roof by increasing some of the insulation benefits. And so that was a really important component. And of course, the plant material itself could absorb some particulate matter and sequester a little bit of carbon as well. And the evapotranspirative properties of that roof could potentially decrease ambient air temperatures as well a little bit. So if you compare the temperature of a green roof versus a conventional roof, or a green roof versus just the ground, a green roof is much cooler. And of course, the lifespan of a roof increases pretty dramatically with a green roof on top of it. For those of us that live in the city and have a flat roof, we know that those roofs get pretty beat up and they need to be replaced every 20 or 30 years. Same thing goes for asphalt roofs outside of the city. And if we can put plant material on there, it decreases UV exposure to those engineered materials, which increases the lifespan of that roof, ultimately saving you some money as well in terms of reinstalling new roofs. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that really the research focused on in those very early days. Okay, and sort of one of the, I'd say, founding fathers, grandfathers of green roof research was this German named Manfred Kohler. And in 2006, he published sort of the first, I think, really interesting study that looked at this dynamic aspect of green roof ecosystems. He had monitored plant composition on a series of green roofs in Germany for a number of years. And here's a couple pictures of them right here from like the mid 1990s to the early 2000s. He was doing this monitoring. And what he found was that depending on if it was what he classified as a wet year or a dry year, the plant diversity would change among those years. So in years that were wet, that had more precipitation coming down, there was greater diversity of vascular plants, of annual species, and of spontaneous species. So those that basically colonized the green roof that were not there previously, okay? And he also determined that perennial species, of course, those that grow year on, year out, and are able to survive the winter, the diversity of them did not change interannually. So this was like one of the very first studies that showed how dynamic green roofs were, and that precipitation and water was a really important component. Just a year later, this really important review came out in 2007, and it started to advance the science and the research from just looking at simple plant selection and simple, growing media properties, to thinking about green roofs from a more ecological perspective, and integrating even some of these socio-ecological components that I'm going to be talking about a little bit this year. And this was very influential to me because I started my dissertation research in 2009, just 2 years after this paper was published. And my passion for science and ecology grew out of this fascination with understanding, why are plants live where they live? That was always so fascinating. Why is that plant growing there? Why is that one doing well over there? What explains that? And that's what actually drove me to go to graduate school to study ecology. And as I got to New York City, and I began to think about this question, to reframe that question, to try to understand what factors affected the distribution and composition of plant species on green roofs. Okay, but just basically applying that age-old question in ecology to the rooftop. All right, and so that's where we're going to get into some of the ecology of green roofs. So back in 2010, we in collaboration with Columbia University, New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, under the leadership of Matt Palmer at Columbia University, we installed a citywide green roof experiment. Okay, we selected 10 locations across New York City, including Queens and Staten Island, not to be left out. And on each one of these roofs that we can see in this map over here, we installed 12 2-meter by 4-meter plots, like mini green roofs, if you will, on these park and recreation buildings. Okay, so each one of those 10 locations had those 12 plots on it, and but each location, of course, was situated in urban space in a slightly different way, right? And so these 8 pictures show sort of what the urban space looked like around 8 of these roofs, right? So we had some plant material in some, more plant material surrounding, in others more canopy cover and grassland, and in other areas we maybe had more major highways and more buildings and bare rooftops than others. So okay, so that was installed in 2010. And then on each roof, it was, I'm sorry, my lights are, give me 1 second here, guys. That's a little bit. Can you guys still see me? Yeah, great. On each one of these rooftops, each of these 12 plots, we had varying amounts of growing media installed in each of these plots. So here we had a replicated experimental design where we could tease apart the sort of the influence of growing media death and maybe the influence of spatial location on these green roofs. Okay, and we sort of did exactly what Manfred Kohler did, which I think many of us here probably do as well, which is we just go out and see what's growing. We put this growing media down and we didn't do anything to it. We waited a year and we surveyed the plants that had just naturally colonized these rooftop plots, okay, with no extra planting of any kind. And this is a really complex figure with lots of stuff on it. But the key point here is on the left-hand side, deeper media, deeper growing media. The deeper the growing media, the greater the plant biomass, the greater the percent cover of plant material in the plot, and the greater the functional richness that we observed, right? So on the horizontal axis on each one of these figures here is increasing growing media. So we had as little as 6 centimeters of growing media, right? Just a little more than 2 inches, all the way up to 12 to 15 centimeters of growing media, like 4 or 5 inches. Okay. And so we had just these slopes, right? These lines. So as growing media increased, the number of plants that we counted that spontaneously colonized increased. The amount of plant biomass that we sampled increased, and the percent cover increased. A couple of these relationships were non-significant, but we did identify that functional richness increased with plant biomass too. And basically functional richness is basically like taking plants and distilling them down to their trait characteristics rather than their species identities, right? So like forbs, grasses, tall forbs, short grasses, tall grasses, just looking at the general growth habits and characteristics. And when we looked at that, we also found that functional richness increased as it relates to increased growing media depth. So after we surveyed these 10 plots from across New York City to look at what colonized them naturally, we went ahead and planted a palette of 18 different native plant species selected from 2 native plant communities surrounding New York City. One, the Hempstead Plains, which is an important conservation land. There's only it's the only plains that's east of the Mississippi. It's found on Long Island. It was historically, many acres, and now there's just a small remnant of it left, about 15, 18 acres in Nassau County. And we selected a plant palette of 8 species from there. And then we went up to the Rocky Summit grasslands in like Bear Mountain, Harriman State Park, those kind of upper elevations, and selected species from there. And then we went ahead and planted them on these 10 green roofs. And we split these plots. You could see those plots from before. Here's at the ground level. We split those 2 meter by 4 meter plots in half. And we planted 100 individuals of the Rocky Summit grasslands on one side and 100 individuals of the Hempstead Plains on the other side. And we had these little planting maps that we knew the location of each and every one of those individuals that we planted. And so we planted a total of 24,000 individual plants across these 10 rooftops. And then we monitored survivorship of these plants for the next couple of years, whether they survived or died. Okay, I'm going to share some of those results with you here, but here's a couple of pictures of what these roofs looked like. This is over here in Staten Island. Love Staten Island, Lions Pool over there. This is down in Brooklyn and Brownsville. This is a picture of the Rocky Summit grasslands. You can see Rudbeckia, Lespedeza, and a couple others in there. Here's the Hempstead Plains. We can see Little Bluestem. We can see Panicum virgatum in there, Mountain Mint, and a couple others. And here again is an example in Brooklyn, Hansborough up there. So when we tabulated the results, we again had this experimental design, this roof that we planted exactly the same at the same time at 10 locations all across New York City. And we were able to parse apart what factors in our experimental design explained the various survivorship amounts that we observed. Okay, so what we found was that if we parsed apart that variation in survivorship, we found that 29% of the variation was explained by the locations of the roof. So just the fact that you're planting this thing at a bunch of different locations, 29% of the variation in survivorship can be explained by the fact that we plant things in a bunch of different locations. So what does that tell us? That tells us, of course, that, just because one set of plants works on one roof, it may not necessarily work on another roof. Okay, so we always need to be careful about generalizing findings. So that was an important contribution. Nobody had really done that before. All previous studies had been done on a single location and oftentimes even on the ground. The other component is that we found that growing media depth explained some variation, but not as much as people had been suggesting. Growing media depth always was thought, everybody thought, oh, growing media depth is the main factor affecting plant survivorship, and we found that it wasn't as important as among roof factors and species identity. Of course, it matters a lot which species you choose. Each species has different characteristics, traits, and so different species are going to have different levels of survivorship. And what we found, these were the best performing species. You guys might be interested in this. Little blue stem, switchgrass, Panicum virgatum, and Sargastrum nuntas, Indian grass. Those were all C4 photosynthetic grass species from the Hempstead Plains that performed the best by far. 60% or more survived after a year of on that roof with basically no additional maintenance. And then in the Rocky Summit grasslands, we found that common hairgrass, Xanthonia spicata, Pycnanthemum, mountain mint, and Lespedeza capitata, bush clover, all performed really, really well. And what's interesting is that these, two plant palettes are very different from one another, right? We have a little tuft grass here. We have this sort of woody, sort of low growing, sort of like woody shrub, not a woody shrub, but like a woody forb. And then we have this nitrogen fixer in Lespedeza, whereas in Hempstead Plains, they're all these tall, growing C4 grasses. If we look at, this is sort of a complicated figure, but the key point, we'll see a couple of these to come. So I'm going to just explain it real quick. All right. So these are non-ordination plots. Maybe we've seen a couple of these before, but ordination plots, basically each one of these dots represents a sample or a plot. Each one of these dots represents one of those plots on the roof, and it represents the composition of plant species in that plot. The closer the dots are to one another, the more similar the plant composition is. If they're far apart, it means the composition is very different, the plant composition. Okay. And what we did was we found, that, and then we correlated environmental factors and other factors with the plant composition data. And the key thing that we found is that native plant survivorship, the ones that we planted, was opposite, correlated in an opposite direction with colonization. And we also found that more solar radiation on a roof correlated with lower native plant survivorship and higher colonist cover or colonization by non-native plant species. All right, so that's the key finding. And that we think explained a fair amount of the variation that we observed among all the roofs. So basically, differing environmental conditions on each roof, right? Slightly different. And it could have had to do with a little bit of the shading from surrounding buildings. It could have had to do with a little bit of the canopy cover from surrounding buildings. That was probably some of the main factors that explain that. Okay, so once we looked at the native plants, we actually looked at these colonist plants as well. And so what were those colonizing plants that came on? We planted with 16 species to begin with. And what we found was that 63 new species colonized our green roofs, and we collected all those species. As you can see them in the lab, dried them, weighed them, and I'll present some of these data here. But what we found was that just 12 species accounted for more than 90% of the total dry biomass that we collected from these roofs. So there was clearly several species that were very dominant relative to the others. And as you saw before, and as we described, the native plant communities looked a little bit different on each of these roofs. And the result of that, that looking differently was that the colonists that came onto those roofs looked different as well. So in the Rocky Summit grasslands that were dominated by Lespedeza and Rudbeckia and Danthonia spicata, the tuft grass, okay, we got a lot of grasses that installed. 71% of the colonists were grasses. Whereas in the Hempstead Plains, we had lots of grasses that were already really successful in there. And we had more forb species. 72% of the colonists were forb species coming in. So we're seeing sort of a complementary effect going on here. And whatever's there to begin with is going to influence what is able to colonize. And in fact, we can look at this another way, and we can look at this sort of below the ground and see that grasses tend to have these fibrous roots. And in many cases, they're growing to the bottom of the substrate of the container, hitting the bottom of that shallow growing media and then spreading out along the round, leaving perhaps some growing media at the surface for forbs like Rudbeckia hirta and other fast growing ruderal species to colonize and grow quickly. All right. So we have a little bit of below ground dynamics and sort of complementary and competition going on here. And below ground is very interesting, right? So we have plant species kind of interacting in interesting ways above ground. And then we have the below ground dynamics. And below ground, we know, of course, that there are mycorrhizal fungi and other bacteria and all kinds of microbes that are involved in nutrient cycling and help plants survive or are pathogenic. And there's been some researchers, Krista McGuire, who was previously at Barnard College, really led all this wonderful research investigating the below ground dynamics on these very same roofs. And what her team found was that there was no difference in the species composition of these microbes when you looked at each one of these roofs. So there's the little plot, the ordination plot here, there's no difference between all the roofs. They're all basically random, okay? They're all similar to one another, all right? Which is a bit different from the plant material, but kind of interesting. All these roofs are being similar below ground. However, when we compare the roofs, the green roof soil microbes to microbes on the ground in the parks, we see very distinct differences, okay? Excuse me, I jumped ahead. When we compare roofs with sedum or those low-growing succulents to planting pallets like I was just showing you there with native plants and meadows growing with grasses and forbs, we see very distinct differences. Okay, that's where we see the distinct differences. All right. And we can see that here, mixed vegetation versus sedum. And as time goes on these roofs, we continued to monitor these roofs for their plant composition for 6 years after we initially planted them in 2011. And over time, more and more colonists came onto these rooftops, and eventually native colonist cover decreased and introduced species continued to come in. And eventually it became like 25% native species that we installed originally, and 75% were colonists that entered into, or spontaneous individuals. Here we can see Lions Pool again in Staten Island, my favorite. And we can see a representation of the richness of plant species on these various roofs 6 years later. So we can see colonist richness has increased. Richness is, of course, is the number of individual species, right? And so we can see almost in all cases, there were more colonists on these roofs than original plant palette. Here's a couple more pictures showing, all of the somewhat common cosmopolitan species that we're used to. And if we look at those initial 16 native plant species that performed well, which ones still did well 7 years later? And what we find is that a lot of them died out of a lot of plots, right? Here we're showing percentage of plots. Only six. The highest proportion was Rebecca Herta in 60% of plots that were originally all had these plants planted in them. So no other species even was barely above 25%. 1 in 4 plots had these native plants that were still alive in them. So most of the native species didn't do terribly well on these green roofs that we tested. Okay, we didn't do a lot of maintenance, so these were pretty much left wild for quite a few years. But it shows that these green roofs changed substantially through time. But yet, you saw those pictures, still the green roofs are covered with plant material still. And in fact, most roofs had 80% cover on them or more 6 years later when we conducted this analysis. And then here are some of the common colonists that we observed: annual fleabane, yellow foxtail, wood sorrel, crabgrass, horseweed, spotted spurge, yellow nutsedge, and black medic. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with many of these cosmopolitan commons that we find. Okay, so getting past the plants and the below ground dynamics, of course, those are systems that support higher trophic levels. And we find that arthropod abundance and richness in some cases is higher on green roofs than conventional roofs. This came out of Dustin Partridge and Alan Clark, who were at Fordham and the New York Green Roof Researchers Alliance at the New York City Audubon. And they also found that bird vocalization and therefore bird utilization of green roofs to paired conventional roofs or roofs that did not have green roofs on them, we saw increase in activity there as well. So more biodiversity at higher trophic levels on green roofs compared to conventional flat roofs with nothing on it. So that's great. We're increasing biodiversity in the city, and that's certainly one of our goals. And here's the slide that I was mentioning before, where we actually see also out of Krista's work, where the below ground dynamics on the ground are very different than the below ground dynamics on the roof. Microbial communities differ significantly on the ground versus on the roof. So I'm starting to paint a picture that these roofs are unique to each other, but they're also different from the ground. We're not replacing the ground per se with these green roofs. The roofs are a unique ecosystem and should be treated as such. And if we go a little bit deeper into that, we can find that recent studies that just published earlier this year, comparing arthropod communities to the ground and to the roof, show that they are different. The roofs do not become like the ground or completely like the ground. And instead, the roofs become more similar to one another than like the ground. So again, we're not replacing that lost space. Another study that Dustin and Dr. and Alan Clark produced actually showed that when they monitored other roofs, some of these roofs that I've talked about in this study, before and after the installation of green roofs, of small green roofs, they actually didn't, in some cases, see an increase in bird activity on these roofs. And they think that perhaps the size of the green roof may influence the degree to which the green roof is able to serve as habitat. Okay. By contrast, they also conducted research on the Javits Center green roof, where there was a huge 6-acre green roof, and they saw quite a bit of bird diversity on that green roof, although they did not pre-post study that site. Okay. Another study also looked at pollen dispersal that's recently come out that basically just says that, pollen dispersal, while we think that green roofs might increase habitat connectivity, sort of acting as little islands connecting green space, and allowing gene flow to occur, the results from this pollen study suggest that maybe it doesn't allow as much gene flow as we might think initially. So even though green roofs are great in many ways, they may not be, as good as ground level green space, and they may not provide as much of a biodiversity benefit as maybe we would like them to, or we initially think that they might have, right? So lots more research to do on this. All right, shifting gears here to green roof sociology. Of course, early research out of the 1980s and 1990s showed that views of nature decrease indicators of stress, physiological indicators of stress. Okay, and so there is a hypothesis that nature exposure decreases stress. There is certainly some mixed evidence to support this notion, but nonetheless, as we've talked about, humanity has been using nature to our benefit in buildings and construction for many, 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 many years. And a recent paper from O'Hara and Amy Tuninga, one of my mentors from Fordham, who's currently at Montclair State University, published this paper arguing that hospitals with green roofs on them could have important benefits for those hospitals, right? They could be essentially spaces where people could go and decrease the amount of stress and improve their prognoses when they're at hospitals. Patients could go and visit them. And some of those early pioneering studies actually took people in hospitals and had them looking at, brick walls versus verdant landscapes. And those people that were looking at those verdant landscapes got out of the hospital faster and had better prognoses than those that looked at the brick walls. So there is some evidence out there suggesting this. And in another study done by Starry and her group, they actually surveyed hospital administrators of hospitals that currently do have rooftop gardens or green roofs. There's about 100 of them across the United States. And she found that the hospital administrators felt that the patient experience was improved when those green roofs were there, and that they were important marketing tools, perhaps as a luxury component, right? Like, our hospital's so beautiful, it's got these beautiful verdant rooftops that you can go on and experience. So there's an economic component likely to the decision to go into whether or not we're installing green roofs. Of course, out of the educational literature, there is also some evidence that points to nature exposure improving learning, again, through this mechanism of decreased stress and increased concentration. There have been studies where they've taken students and sort of had them exposed to natural landscapes and then done sort of attention tests on them, and results have suggested that their attention is improved and they can be more primed to learn. We've sort of taken advantage, when I was part of the Wildlife Conservation Society, we took advantage of this, and we actually had, in my program, Project True, we actually went out and utilized green roofs to conduct research experiments, okay? And right here on the Bronx Zoo campus, the Center for Global Conservation, the CGC, has a green roof on it, and we actually had students on there studying that green roof for many, many years. The green roof was installed in 2009, and just like the other green roofs that I showed you, changed through time. And the plant composition changed through time, and the students actually conducted research projects on those green roofs. And of course, here's a picture of some of my students, high school students, undergraduates, primarily high school students and undergraduates. Here's one of the many posters that they created that They were presented at conferences and symposium. This one focused on, again, stormwater management of green roofs and classified the composition of species on that green roof that you saw. And what we did was we actually went in and surveyed the high school students and the undergraduates to understand the impact of this program that we did, this research mentoring program on them, where they were utilizing green roofs as educational research sites. Okay. And what we found was that undergraduates who were mentoring high school students in this program context felt that their mentoring skills increased as a result of participating in our mentoring program. And we also found that high school students high school students that were mentored by undergraduates that they felt they received good mentoring from saw an increase in their science identity. So the high school students that were out there on those green roofs with those undergraduate students, they were really feeling like scientists, feeling like they were participating in science when they were out on those green roofs. One undergraduate student said this: we had the freedom to guide our own projects, which I enjoyed. It would have been a drag if we had to do research I wasn't happy with. It was nice. It wasn't a pre-packaged research project. And then when we looked at sort of the influence of this program on our high school students, we saw that field work sort of continued to be pretty important experience that had an impact on them years after the program. Even, a couple of years later, while the mentor was important initially after the program, a couple of years later, the mentor became much less important, and that experience of being on a green roof and other urban ecosystems was more and more important to those students. They also felt that they were part of nature. They responded highly to the question about, I want to take care of the environment, and then I was part of nature. So again, we were showing here that green roofs were an educational tool that these students were able to use and get a lot of benefit from using those green roofs. So just a couple last slides here about policy and planning, which is not my expertise, but I think important. I think the first thing I want to say is that green roofs are still highly unevenly distributed. Okay. Of course, most affluent areas have the most amount of green roofs. And I had a student, Sultana Mohammed, who studied green roofs with me all the way back in 2018 as part of Project True. Graduating from Barnard College just this past year, she conducted her senior thesis research project with me and conducted an analysis of the relationship between the distribution of green roofs and redlining. So there is just a representation of that. I can't get into the details on it at the moment, but very interesting. Again, linking the sociological and ecological components. There are policy instruments in place here in New York City to encourage green roofs. The New York City tax abatement is still in effect until 2024. And there are certain areas that are in around water bodies that are contributing to combined sewer areas that are priority areas that you can get upwards of $15 per square foot of a tax abatement if you install a green roof. And green roofs are fairly expensive. They can be $15, $30 a square foot or more, depending on how intensive the green roof ultimately is. And that's it. So in conclusion, my argument tonight, my thesis tonight has been that green roofs are socio-ecological systems, right? They're constructed ecosystems that are influenced by the preferences of stakeholders and designers, okay? And they are dynamic ecosystems that change through time from the perspective of plants, from the perspective of microbes, and from higher trophic levels as well. And that experiences on green roofs can have positive influences on people. Here goes that circle of that socio-ecological dynamic. And with that, I will take any questions and thank all of the many people and organizations that have supported me financially and from mentoring and all the stuff. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. That was super informative in a bunch of different areas, from the history all the way up to all the different projects that you guys did. And I know, okay, I have kind of a silly, maybe it's not, it's just a simple question perhaps about the green roofs. How high can you build a green roof? How many floors is it before the building is too tall?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So yeah, so the important thing to consider when installing a green roof is the structural integrity of the roof. So I don't think that there's a limit on how tall you can install. There's been examples of green roofs on 30-story buildings. Whether or not organisms can travel up to that rooftop is an open question. As we talked about, the connectivity potential of green roofs is a little bit in question right now in terms of a sort of a habitat framework. But I don't think that there's a limit on how high or how low a green roof can be. The major limiting factor is the structural integrity of that roof, right? Because growing media on the roof plus water can be heavy. And of
Yeah.
course, you need to have an engineer assess that before you can install it. And so that's the main limiting factor.
Okay, nice. So I see, Jane, you have your hand raised, and if anybody else has any questions, you can feel free. You'll be in the queue. But Jane, you can go ahead.
No, thank you, first of all, for a really terrific talk. And hi, Lydia. I saw you yesterday. But what I'd like to know a little bit, because I've been on the 5-borough top twice, years ago
Cool.
as a visitor, and last year because I was volunteering, and 2 of us were invited over with a few people, and Max talked to us each time.
Oh, Max
And
is
things
wonderful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But one thing that kept being mentioned both times was about wind. You did say something about shade and sun, but at another time you mentioned that native communities were on one side, one kind, and on the other, but would maybe one of those sides had more wind and sun when you did that. And was that taken into account? And how does that play in? But basically, I just loved what you presented.
Well, thank you so much, Shane. It's very nice to hear that. And yeah, so what we found was that the more solar radiation, the lower the native plant survivorship. So basically, a little bit more shade probably kept the roof a little bit cooler, probably, prevented, kept a little bit more moisture on that roof rather than it all evaporating off really quickly, and probably encouraged a little bit more survivorship. Again, kind of connecting to Manfred Kohler's findings in 2006, that more moisture content is generally associated with, more plant diversity. So that's what we think is going on there. Mhm.
That's why I was a little concerned when you said half of the plants, one kind of community was on one side and the other
Oh,
type on the other. I didn't know if
yes,
one kind got the sun and the wind or lack of it, and if that
good.
played into it at all.
Oh, that's such a good question, Jane. And that comes down to experimental design. So the way that we tried to address that was by, each one of these plots, you can see them right here. They're long with the split down the middle. They were randomly assigned. So all the individual plants were completely randomly assigned to
Oh.
their locations. And each side of those things, they're called split plots, were randomly assigned, and everything was random across the entire thing. So that's supposed to, from a statistical standpoint, sort of, eliminate that as a
I
potential
missed that you
concern.
had done that.
Yes, yeah,
But
no,
it
great.
was really excellent. And you brought up so many important things. And as you said, there's lots left to learn.
Lots left to learn. Yes, we're still in the nascent stages of our research here, for sure.
I was thinking about that earlier, about also this native versus like introduced plants, and I wonder also when it's this very like more hot and more dry, that the plants that these pioneer species are, that's what they're adapted to, and they do a lot better in that environment. So it kind of, they're happy with that.
Yeah, so we didn't talk too much about the traits or the properties of these plants beyond, C4 individuals, which are a little bit more tolerant of hot temperatures, but succulents that have waxy coatings on the outside, the cuticle, they're able to hold in more moisture. They're able to do multiple different kinds of photosynthesis, and they have parts that allow them to hold on to water. different kinds of below ground plant constructs allow some species to be more stress tolerant and sort of last during prolonged periods of drought, like those succulents. Whereas other species, those pioneer species, Lydia, that you're mentioning, like those are selected species like Rudbeckia hirta that has lots of seeds that are produced and can grow pretty quickly, year after year, they might be able to, they're disturbance adapted species, right? And they can grow up quickly, but also, if there is a prolonged period of drought, they might die off. So what we think is that, sort of a combination of our selected species or disturbance adapted species that can sort of fill in holes and some stress tolerant species that can be there with longevity is sort of the best combination of individuals to maximize your above ground biomass. And I didn't even get into this at all, but the whole point of us trying to expand our plant palette is to really increase the amount of biomass and structural diversity on those roofs so that we can have more carbon sequestration, that we can have more evapotranspiration, and then we can have greater habitat space and diversity to encourage urban biodiversity. So that's a great point, Lydia. And some of the research that Matt Palmer's group has been doing has been actually looking at the functional, the evapotranspirative properties of different leaves of different colonist and native plant species. And some colonist species, don't provide as many services, ecosystem services, as those native plant species. But it's always going to be a trade-off because you have to maintain these systems. They change through time, and so how much maintenance, how much you're going to invest into this roof are all open questions. We all, if any of us have done any gardening, we know that it's you have to put a lot of time in there, and those weedy species, which I hate that word weed because I love all plants and they're all just plants in my view, and those weedy species, they're just successful hard workers able to grow in all these interesting and cool environments. I think if we change the way that we sort of sometimes think about plant species, we can and we think about the fact that these rooftops, they are not natives, they are constructed systems that are created by humanity. And so we can't, I would caution thinking about them as trying to replace the ground. They are engineered systems, and so we should be thinking about them a little bit of a different way than we think about ground level systems.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How much green space on a roof is needed for it to be considered a green roof?
That is a super good question. And Mike Triglia's group out of the Nature Conservancy, who published the paper about the distribution of green roofs across the city, got really deep into that in their classification. I can't recall all the specifics of their methodology, so I'll refer you to go look at that paper. But I think that they sort of came up with like 80, it was like a certain percentage of the rooftop had to have plant material on it for it to be considered a green roof.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Also, so obviously green roofs are beneficial for not just us, but our beloved fellow earthlings, and also our well-being and just aesthetics. So green roofs, I think almost everybody can agree, are a good thing, but we don't see that many of them. There's a lot, but it's not the norm. What sort of challenges do you think that people who are pushing for green roofs are facing that are maybe pushing back?
Yeah, right here in New York City, there's only about 60 acres of green roofs across all of New York City. And it's about what I think it's 20 to 30% of the surface area of Manhattan is rooftop space, something in that neighborhood. Okay, so there is an enormous potential, certainly, for the expansion of green roofs. I would say that the major challenge is cost. They are expensive. They could, as I mentioned before, $15 to $30 per square foot, and that's a big expense when you talk about 100 square feet. And then go from 100 square feet is nothing, right? It's a tiny little thing. So you're talking about big expenses for these things, and that's why the tax abatements and policy incentives are, I think, important. Another important, and I didn't even mention this. There was a bill introduced into Congress in 2000, and it was a $500 million funding bill to try to fund the installation of green roofs on public schools all across the United States. So, and when we've looked at some of the other countries like Canada and Germany and France, they all have put policy instruments in place to basically require people to install green roofs on certain size buildings in certain areas. And that's likely what we would need to do, a sort of a combination of those two things.
All right, I think we have time really quick for one last question.
Yeah, happy to.
We have Janetti has their hand raised. If you want to go ahead.
Hi, guys. I have a question precisely about public schools. Do you know around the city which public schools already have green roofs? Because, we at the District 3, we are trying to create more gardening and outdoors learning opportunities for the kids. And I will be very interested to reach out to schools that already have that in place and learn from them experience.
Yeah, good, great. So the best example of a public school with a green roof on it is PS 41, and the person that was instrumental in creating that green roof was Vicky Sando, Sando, I think, and she is the educational lead for the New York Green Roof Researcher Alliance, New York City Green Roof Researcher Alliance. I would strongly suggest that you reach out to her. She is extremely involved in that educational green roof space. She's a great resource, and I'm sure she would have more to provide to you. I would also suggest to anybody here to go to the New York City Green Roofs website, which is run by the New York City Green Roof Researchers Alliance, that has lots of information on it for anybody to check out. Tons more information about all the kinds of stuff that I'm talking about, and practical stuff, links to tons and tons of information. You can get in touch with Vicky there as well. Installing green roofs on public schools in New York City, as you might imagine, it sounds like you're involved with schools, is fraught with challenges, because the main limitation is that in order to get to install a green roof on a public school building in New York City, it's like the backlog of things that are old about that school need to be addressed before you can do new construction on the building. And so it creates just this, it's very challenging from a number of different angles. Great.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, guys. It was wonderful chatting with you. This was really a pleasure to chat about this with all you guys. I love talking about this stuff. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing all of it.
Thank you so much, Gab.
All right, we'll let you go.
Yes.
Stay well, everybody, and maybe we'll see you next week with our other talk or at one of our things in the future. Have a good one.
Ciao.